This episode of Troxel is supported by Avail. Avail helps AECO firms better manage, organize, and navigate information faster. Visit getavail.com today. This episode of Troxel is supported by Confluence, which is now more than a conference. It's also a video podcast where AEC industry software developers take us behind the scenes and share their design and decision-making process to show how they made the tools we all use to design the built environment. It's available on YouTube and Spotify. Follow the link in the show notes and subscribe today. Welcome to the Troxel Podcast. I'm Evan Troxel. In this episode, I welcome Nathan Miller back to the podcast. Nate is the founder of Proving Ground, a digital transformation agency, and he specializes in collaborating with designers and builders to implement digital strategies for reducing waste, enhancing creativity, and making better decisions about the built environment. In addition to developing new software, like the popular Lunchbox plugin for Grasshopper and Dynamo, Nate frequently publishes writings about digital business practices, critical evaluation of technology trends, and ethical considerations influencing the adoption of new technology in the construction industry. There's also a very useful weekly workflow series running over at the Proving Ground blog, showing off how to implement their machine learning tools and Lunchbox plugins, for example, that caught my eye a couple of months ago. You should definitely check it out by following the link in the show notes. Today, we discuss the importance of maintaining a critical view when it comes to tools and technology, the need to evaluate new technologies and innovations carefully to determine if they align with your desired goals, the value of balancing established experience with new advancements, and fostering bi-directional learning between innovators and experienced professionals, the value of navigating the constantly evolving nature of technology and architectural design, the importance of learning from previous projects to drive continuous improvement, and other topics. So without further ado, I bring you my conversation with Nate Miller. I would love to just talk about Proving Ground. I'd love to talk about kind of how you got, because the last time we talked, we didn't talk about that as far as I remember. I mean, it's a fuzzy time in history, I think, but I remember us talking about COVID and just like, it was great to have a conversation. And so like wherever it goes is wherever it goes. I don't actually like to set an agenda up front, but I would like to show, talk about what you're doing, and you're doing the Lord's work, I'm sure.
Well, we can let the listeners decide if, we did the first one in 2020.
Yeah.
And now we're in 2023. Has Nate become more or less anxious and unhinged in that time span? Because it doesn't really seem like the crisis of world events has really ever gone away.
No.
It's just sort of been like, there's just been more.
Yeah.
There's just, different versions, more of them. And so your listeners can be like, whoa, we thought, he was on the edge in 2020, and now he's really taken the plunge.
I read something, Nate, that was like, you get like more and more anxious, and I know maybe angry, maybe like questioning until like age 55 is like the culmination of all that. And then it just gets better. And it's like, something happens, I'm sure that's just like some number that is an average, but
well, it's like reaching the top of a roller coaster. You're like, you're at the top, you're like, okay, I'm 55 now. I'm just going to coast. I'm on my way down. This is all someone else's problem.
To hell with it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right. That's right. Well, I'm getting there. I think this is good to have a combo. I turned 40 this year. And I think it's like, I didn't think it would mean too much, but it's kind of like in the back of your mind, I'm like, I'm not in my 30s anymore.
Right.
And I think about technology and the space that we operate in. And, you're always told, at least I always felt like, when I was first getting into the the architecture and computational design scene, you'd have the project, the senior project manager or principal talking about how, oh, he's into the new stuff. It's a young person's game,
Yeah. Yeah.
And now I'm kind of get to be that older guy. I mean, like,
Yeah.
and
You're still an emerging professional. You're still a youngster in the architectural profession. You have to have some serious gray hair to be considered senior anything,
Well, between you and me, I don't think I'll ever have gray hair.
Just between
us. As you can tell from my haircut, I don't know. It could be gray right now. I wouldn't know.
Yeah.
I wouldn't know.
It's like I grow my beard out. I don't actually. My wife won't allow it. But when it pokes out, it's like, whoa, there. It's just white, man. Like, what happened?
That's right.
What happened? Where'd that come from? Oh my God. Yeah. It's eye-opening at that point.
Sure.
You actually feel it. So anyway, yeah, let's talk about Proving Ground. Let's talk about what you've been up to for the last 3 years, 2.5 years since we talked. I mean, that was an episode for the books. That was like solid COVID time. We were just like getting our feet back under us. And I mean, so much has happened since then. And you are creating order out of chaos, which is the AEC tech sphere, and maybe just the architectural profession in general. But like the tools that you make, the training that you provide, you go in and you kind of do these assessments on firms, and you've always been kind of the champion of digital transformation when it comes to architecture, using technology to its benefit. So, I mean, let's talk about Proving Ground. Let's talk about Nate Miller, who is the founder of and the team behind what you're working on.
Sure. Yeah. It's Proving Ground turned 8 years old as a company this year. And before that, if I really rewind the clock, Proving Ground was a blog.
Right.
And
that's
even
right.
Even to this day, there's that blog element to it. And, if I really think back to what really motivated, I guess, that initial genesis was, maybe a idea of a question on what can technology really do to benefit the building design, originally the building design process, because I was a designer at the time. And,
right.
As we all know, when you're a designer, that's all you can think about is design. And it becomes kind of your whole world.
Right.
But I think we've kind of broadened the scope quite a bit in more recent years as we've been thinking about construction and operations. But it really did start as a way to sort of, and this is, I guess, the name of the company and previously the blog, to prove that this new stuff, technology and computation and, tech being the umbrella term, can actually transform how we work to a better kind of state, whether it's better design, a better construction process, or a better life cycle management of the building. And when I first was like getting into this space, the blog really was more of a journal than anything else. You kind of have a set of interest areas, like, oh, what if you had a grasshopper definition help you plan your building, and like, what would that look like? And the you could actually probably go back to some of those early posts where it's like, oh yeah, you could probably do something with novel uses of tessellation and figure out relationships between kind of auto-generated geometry and think about planning that way. Or you're using something like one of the OG Grasshopper plugins, Kangaroo. Maybe can we actually use a physics engine to help us solve how spaces might come together in some way, right? And so it really was like this journal or diary of experiments, which eventually became, oh, I'm going to write my own plugin now. And the first one I wrote was a plugin called Slingshot, which was all about sending data out of Grasshopper into a database, and then Lunchbox, which if I rewind the clock, I think that was like 2010, 2011, when the first release of
Wow.
Lunchbox was out. And that one was derived from like, I just wanted to go. I mean, in some ways, it was kind of driven by, I just want to be able to get through this competition as fast as possible, because I know I'm going to be doing paneling systems, and I know I'm going to be doing a lot of complex geometry and structure. So can I create a plugin that will help me get through this without having to reinvent it every time? And that's what Lunchbox became. And if I then kind of look at our current state, what I like to think Proving Ground has become, we're a company now, which is very different than someone sitting in front of the computer writing a blog.
Right.
But a lot of that sort of original kind of thinking from those days, where you're experimenting, you're asking questions, you're looking at what can a building design and construction and operations process look like if we were to employ certain techniques or technologies, has really been a driver for a lot of our work today. And, that's kind of turned into different forms of service. You mentioned the strategy side, which is super important. I'd like to actually talk a lot about that, because it feeds into maybe some peripheral subject matters related to what we're seeing happening today with generative AI and all that other stuff. And a lot of people are asking a lot of questions right now in their practices, like what is this going to do? But you have the strategy side, you have, continuing to build tools. We've productized some of them. And that was really, I guess, that really started in 2020. In some ways, that was a survival instinct in some ways, because we didn't know what was going to happen. And all of a sudden our in-person training,
right,
and in-person workshops and strategy just like
gone.
Went away.
Right.
And so we needed to think about, okay, how can Proving Ground start to put itself out there in new and different ways? And that led to a segment of our stuff becoming more productized, and then different kinds of service, which allowed us to do what we do in a capacity that didn't require us to be in the room physically. Right.
There's a lot there. I mean, I even think back to where you started with this online journal, basically. And my question is, like, how did you decide to make that a public journal versus a private journal? Because I think we see it all the time through it. You're in a position where you're looking at firms and you're seeing the duplication of effort in every one of these firms. And I think one of the big reasons of the duplication of effort is people are not publicly dreaming about this stuff. They're not publicly talking about this stuff. And so therefore they're in their own silo. Maybe they're looking at what other people are doing, but because the majority don't publicly put out there what they're working on, in the sense that you did with Proving Ground and the blog, I think that's just a very different approach. Why did you decide to go that route instead of keeping it to yourself?
That's a really good question. I don't know if I know the exact answer to that. I first started the blog right as I graduated from school. And at the time, it wasn't even called Proving Ground. It was just like, I heard of people starting, blogs. I had done like, I don't know, this is taking me way back, but pre Facebook days, it was all,
right.
I was like, what was it called? Live Journal.
Yeah.
I was doing that when I was in college, early days of college. And, the Facebook became really popular when I was in college. And so in some ways, I feel like that maybe just instilled a bit of like, okay, in order for, if I think about where the world was going and how street cred and career and things like that may be taking us, where that might be going, it's going to be online. And so in some ways, the starting a blog it served two purposes. One, for my own sake, I could track what I was doing, and maybe if there was some idea of trends and in the work that I was doing and what that would be. But there was also this idea that um, you could kind of make a name for yourself by putting things out there, especially if you're doing things that were really, really new. And at the time, tools like Grasshopper um, were really, really new. And there was a bit of in those early days of Grasshopper, and I think that it still persists to this day. It's a very community driven type of tool.
Yeah.
And I remember when it was in the first days of beta, you had a public Google group where if you wanted to learn anything about Grasshopper, that was the only place you could get any information, because you had David Rutten writing the software. He was like almost building an airplane while he was trying to figure out where to land it,
Yeah, right.
And then you had all these people like contributing ideas and throwing in example files, throwing in files that were needed for debugging. And, you don't want to, I think in that context, you don't want to be the person to be like, okay, I'm going to take all of this and make like this really private thing. You want to like absorb that information and put something else out there, so you can maybe help shift and shape that community in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was really a big driver for that. I think the idea of the community driven development of the tools that I was using, in combination with just a general cultural ethos around putting yourself out there in the, right as social media was becoming super, super popular, gave me that kind of platform with Proving Ground.
It's also where it seems like you found your tribe, right? I mean, that's the idea of an online community, but there's so many other people kind of in your cohort that I would assume kind of came out of you finding those people in that location online.
Sure. I mean, I think so. I mean, there's the, if I think back to, you could almost get really specific here with the Grasshopper stuff, but the original like kind of plug-in cohort that were putting out tools that I think to this day are among the most popular. We mentioned Kangaroo earlier by Daniel Piker. You had Firefly, authored by people like Andy Payne. You have, there are some that I don't know if they've quite continued on. I think about, stuff like I think more recently, like the Ladybug tools that kind of, it's forward a few more years, but it's now one of those kind of staples of the workflow. And then I'd like to put Lunchbox in there too. It's just it's become one of those things, like when people get Grasshopper and people get Rhino, they get those plugins I just mentioned in parallel with it,
right?
Because that's what in some ways gives it its juice, more than what's available out of the box, right?
Especially for architecture, right? I think that, there's some key words when it comes to Grasshopper that are the plugin names that you're mentioning, right? There's others out there as well, like Human UI, or, I mean, there's a bunch of examples, but
Human UI. Yep.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things where in architecture circles, there's kind of the usual suspects of Grasshopper plugins, like you talk about. And I mean, I don't know if they go beyond that. You would know better than I would, being the author of it, but architecture specifically kind of relies heavily, especially I would assume in school, like and really like form finding, design exploration, where everybody's a designer. Those are going to be kind of the plugins that get passed around more than others.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, like I think one of the things that has been very surprising, I'll take Lunchbox as an example. Every now and then I'll get pinged on LinkedIn or directly through email of someone saying what they're doing with this tools. 'Cause I really have no insight into anything that anyone does.
You're not creepy like that. You're like, I
Yeah.
want to see exactly which ones they're clicking on and how they're using them. Yeah, it's all phoning home. Yeah, that doesn't happen.
Yeah. And so for context, I'm pretty against a lot of that. So even with our product stuff, if anyone is interested in knowing that side of the philosophy, we don't track anything. And so the only way I know if someone's doing something cool with it is that they, say, hey, Nate, look what I made. But the original point, I've had people that are designing automobiles showing me something they did with Lunchbox.
Cool.
And I was like, you're using Lunchbox, like the paneling stuff, to do a cool pattern on like a Ford? Like what? Or
That's cool.
Some other and then I saw one pop up on Instagram. This was a couple of years back when we first released some of the ML tools for Lunchbox, and someone had cobbled together like a self-driving, like a virtualized self-driving car, basically a car that figured out its way through a racetrack using some of the ML tools. I was like, what?
What a moment. That's so cool. That's so cool.
And and it was, I don't even know if it was like, was it a student? It may have been a student, it may have been some researcher, but I was like, you couldn't. I'm like, I had no idea you could do that with the tools that I made. And that's actually one of the more gratifying aspects of a lot of it, is like, if you put something out there, you made it for a particular purpose for yourself, but then when it becomes something that you never intended, or becomes something that another author clearly put their stamp on it, I think it becomes way more interesting because of that.
Yeah. And you guys have gone down that road now with Conveyor and Semantic and Tracer, and so I mean, that was maybe your first foray into productizing digital technology, a piece of software, right? And that's led you down this path, like you said, that was kind of kicked off when you started, when COVID happened, because of the uncertainty of all the in-person work that you were doing as well. So let's talk about some of those tools before we get into the strategy side, because I know we bookmarked the strategy stuff. I definitely want to get there. So let's get the product stuff taken care of. But the tools that you guys have developed and released as products are absolutely incredible. And like I said, you're kind of creating some calm in this world of chaos, helping people get their stuff from one tool to another, or visualizing their data, or making useful tools, let's just call it that handle a bunch of different scenarios. But maybe you can go through some of those.
Sure. Yeah. So the tools that we're talking about here, and we can go through each one very briefly. The Conveyor, Semantic, and Tracer are the three tools that we have available on PG apps, our Proving Ground apps. And those were all born out of services initially. They were tools, or the bones of them were tools that were used to solve a real world problem that we as consultants were encountering. Whether it had been a building, or helping someone compose a dashboard, or synthesize some data. And at a certain point, we realized that, hey, some of this stuff might be valuable as a generalizable toolkit. And I think Conveyor is the first example of this. The problem of interoperability between different design applications has been an area of interest of mine for years. If I go back to, like, rewind the clock to the early days of Lunchbox, and between 2009 and 2011, I was working on a stadium at MBBJ, and I think it was one of the first documented use cases of Grasshopper at such a large scale. Right. We were trying to parametrically solve this exterior and kind of interior seating bowl of the stadium with Grasshopper and kind of computational methods, just to get us, in some ways, just because we had to get our way through the project. But there was like this other conundrum with that workflow that we had to figure out was, we're doing this all in Rhino, but we needed to get it over into Revit, because that's that's what our firm was using. That's what MBBJ was using and continues to use, and the other firms are using it. But we had no like path to get there. There was basically at that time we were like looking at novel ways of using SAT, like automating SAT exports and imports in just to get the documentation set, get some drawings out. And that kind of woke me up to the fact that all of the systems that we use in this industry are not very well integrated with each other. And if we think about the time waste that occurs during a design process, there's a good chunk of that is in figuring out how you can move information and data between these platforms that we need to use. And I have a very, I guess, shop-mindedness to me. You know, if I think about a shop, I have different tools for different purposes, and I'm going to grab the tool that's best for the job. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to try to screw something in with a hammer. I'm not going to try to like saw something off with pair of tin snips. You know, you want to pick the right thing. And so I always wondered, like, why can't we have that kind of mentality with our tools? And the thing that prevents a lot of that is like, okay, well, if I use Rhino over here for this purpose, somehow that needs to jump over into Revit to do something else. And maybe it needs to go over to an analysis software to do something else. And so shortly after I left MBBJ and joined Case, which was the company I was with, consulting group out of New York City, in case any are familiar, it was acquired by WeWork, which is why Proving Ground as a company now exists. Long path there. Mm-hmm. But we were interested in, a kind of similar set of things. We started to look at different integrations between these softwares. I was building up different solutions. One was called Rhino, which was a Dynamo Rhino That's reader right. at the time.
Yeah.
And then as Proving Ground got started, we got put onto a couple of projects. One was the Lucas Museum of Narrative Art, currently under construction, and it looks phenomenal. It's taking a long time, but it looks phenomenal. Hats off to that team for what they've done. And the American Museum of Natural History by Studio Gang was another one that we were involved in. And these two projects had challenged us. At the time, it was just two of us, some really small team at Proving Ground, to figure out a way that how we can efficiently move this hyper complex geometry seamlessly between these applications and do it in a way that didn't necessarily require us to be in the driver's seat, because we needed to hand the workflow off to a team. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of where Conveyor was born. We needed to figure out a way for these geometries to transfer, assuming the end user knew nothing about Grasshopper, assuming that there wasn't necessarily an like what we would call advanced modeling toolkit, but maybe a generalized modeling skill set around knowing how to manipulate Rhino models and knowing how to manipulate Revit models using more of the conventional tools. And that's where Conveyor kind of situated itself. And we kind of started building up this toolkit that allowed for that to occur. And right now it's, kind of grown to a point where a number of practices have adopted it as kind of their enterprise-wide solution, which is really cool. They're like, hey, all of our designers use Rhino. All of them use Revit. If you're that kind of firm that is using those tools primarily, Conveyor kind of becomes a way for them to stitch those two together and offset in some ways the necessity for the advanced, Grasshopper toolkit that is oftentimes, as much as powerful as it is, can also become a barrier and cause a bit of a digital divide in an organization. And so we're trying to figure out how we bridge that with Conveyor.
This episode is made possible with support from Avail. What's one of the most painful aspects of working in Revit today? Well, we all know that as a Revit project grows over time, navigating the information in that project becomes ever more taxing. And when more than one person is working on a project, a new wave of challenges arise. It only gets more difficult throughout the life of a project. Good news, a huge update to Avail Desktop was just released. Version 4.5 introduces several powerful new features designed to improve organizing, searching, and finding information within Avail. New features include channel groups, application mappings, and scope searches. But that's not all. Let's talk about the all-new Project Navigator, a powerful new feature in Avail for Revit 5.1 that extends Revit's native project browser to help navigate the dense information you're forced to endure as your projects grow. For the first time, Avail will connect your active project to your standard library with one unified search box. With Project Navigator, you can easily switch between active projects, see recently viewed Revit elements, search across all Revit project elements, yes, all of them, conveniently search Avail with one click, filter by all the different element types, navigate to sheets and views, legends and schedules, view individual elements contained on sheets and navigate to them, view family types, and more importantly, actually drag and drop them right into your project, view instances of each family type currently being used in the model, and more. To read all about the new features and see a video of them in action, visit getavail.com. There you'll find a features pull-down menu, and you can look at all of the different features, including the new Project Navigator. Once again, that's getavail.com, and look in the bar across the top for that features pull-down menu. Thank you to Avail for supporting this episode of Troxel.
And it's like, what makes this easy, right? Like you talked about those other layers of complexity that not everybody's going to get into. And so dialing it back to geometry and maybe some data from this major application to this major application without the grasshopper, without the dynamo part. How do you make, what would this look like if it were easy to get geometry between these two? And you've created an interface that allows that to happen.
That's right.
Yeah.
And, I think the other thing that's fun about that project and product, I think about it as a project, because a project is something that's ongoing. A product always feels so final. In some ways, I think about these things as projects because they're always kind of going.
Software's never done. Yeah.
Yeah, it's never done. But one of the things that became really fun, I think, in post 2020, getting into 2021, 2022, is that Rhino 7 came out, and the McNeil folks had developed Rhino Inside, which introduces the kind of the ability to directly integrate Rhino into another application. And Rhino Inside Revit is like their, in some ways, a flagship example of like, hey, you can now launch Grasshopper within Revit and do with Grasshopper similar things that you might have been doing with Dynamo. And by the way, it starts to solve some of the interoperability challenges between these platforms because they're now kind of directly linked. Well, that became really fun for us because not only did they kind of create the ability to launch Rhino and Grasshopper from within Revit, that pipeline becomes something that a third-party developer like ourselves could actively use to expand on tools like Conveyor. So out of the box, you download Rhino inside Revit. You can open up Grasshopper and do Grasshopper-y things within Revit, have a lot of fun with that. But we can also launch Rhino and then use the Conveyor translators that we've made and have a direct back and forth from Rhino without having to touch Grasshopper. We're kind of able to use the pipeline that the generous folks at McNeil have been able to carve out to allow us to use our logic and our kind of translation methodologies to make the process even easier. So it's like, again, it comes back to that community side of things, right? Like McNeil's part of the community. We're part of the community. There's a lot of people part of this network, and their thinking allowed us to expand our thinking. And, we've been sharing ideas back and forth for a while now. And I think it starts to work both ways. And that's really, really fun when that happens.
And the kinds of geometry that you're sending back and forth, I mean, it's not just boxes, right? It's not just rectangles. It's like the two examples that you cited, the Lucas Museum and the Studio Gang example. I've seen photos of those, and like to actually get that kind of geometry built in the real world as a physical object is incredibly difficult. And tools like these actually make it possible and easier
Right.
at the same time, right? Like that's
That's right.
kind of a holy grail of realizing design intent. It's absolutely incredible.
Yeah. 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 There's not a single, I always like to joke whenever want to give a lecture about those two buildings and our digital workflow as that's a part of it. There's not a single straight line in either of those projects, it seems. And, we had to really, we published a peer reviewed paper through the Acadia conference about some of the stuff that we were doing with novel mesh translation. And historically, meshes have been like the bane of every Revit modeler or BIM, anyone that's doing BIM, the bane of their existence, because it's like mesh. What can we do with it? We need solids. We need really clean solids, which is naturally gravitated, I think, a lot of those platforms to being able to we think about them as boxy modelers.
Mm-hmm.
Draw these normative buildings till you're blue in the face, right?
Mm-hmm.
But meshes are really powerful ways of conveying complex shapes, and you can get very they're the basis of entertainment software, character modeling. They're the basis of everything when it comes to just displaying geometry on your screen. And so a lot of the workflow development that was done for those projects was about how we can actually capture the mesh in such a way that it can be cut, that it will look good on a sheet, be part of the documentation, have a level of fidelity to it that is supportive of the design intent. We don't want it to be too coarse. We don't need it to be too detailed. So we developed, ways of, refining those meshes as part of that whole translation workflow process. And it became such that's, one of the more interesting features of Conveyor, if we get into the specifics of the different things it translates, is how it handles the mesh component and makes them usable, and part of BIM in a way that I don't think were previously.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's get through your other two as well. So, which one do you want to talk about next? Conveyor.
Well, I think those two are like companions in many ways, because they touch on business intelligence, and the idea of telling a story with your data. And when I was at Case, we were doing a lot of work with Tableau at the time, because we were basically creating reports to help our clients understand their standards better, like what was in their models, the quality of their digital assets. And that kind of experience opened me up to this world of like, oh, what if you could actually use data as a storytelling device, much like you would use a rendering to tell an architectural story, or a drawing. Can you use the data side of all of this to tell the story, or expand on the story in a way that the more conventional modes of architectural representation don't allow. And so as Proving Ground was getting started, Power BI was becoming more popular. We were starting to see it pop up on desktops of our clients. And, project managers were using it from like a scheduling purpose. And, you'd see accounting departments using it, and, a number of other kind of analysts using that kind of tool. And at a certain point, it became kind of apparent, like, well, what if we could make connections from Power BI into the model assets that people were using, and not only display the data, but display the kinds of representation that we need to be able to tell the story of our architecture. And so that's where semantic and tracer came into play. And I think tracer was in some ways first, because we had been working with building information models for quite a while, and we're very familiar with the Revit underlying data structure. And so tracer started off as a way of, okay, let's get the data out into a database structure, so a structure that sits apart from Revit entirely, such that it can then be hooked in to a place like Power BI, and we can run analysis on quantities and parameter values and element counts, and just basically unpack what's in that model. And then that evolved into, what if we started to serialize geometry in a number of different ways? What if we could convert the areas of a Revit model to a GeoJSON such that you could start to display it in like a mapping viewer? And then what if you were able to take the three-dimensional geometry of a Revit file and turn it into a set of meshes that could then be rendered in a 3D viewer? And could we even get a 3D viewer in Power BI was another kind of big part of that question. And so Tracer was born out of like, okay, we have a data analysis thing. We need to get the data out. And then the viewers became a way for us to then stitch it all back together in Power BI. And with that information, a designer or an architect or a project manager can compose a story within Power BI that tells them something about their building. And I was just on a phone call earlier this week. Phone call. No one does phone calls anymore. It was a Zoom call.
Of course it was.
I feel like I'm just constantly like dating myself in this combo. Again, we'll leave it up to the viewers to decide if I've become more or less unhinged since 2020.
It's okay. We're recording this episode right now on VHS. So yeah.
Okay. Oh, that's my comfort area.
Right.
Hey, perfect. That's a relief. Actually, that would be really funny if you like published like a really grainy VHS quality of this recording.
We're just one filter away from that.
Sidebar, and before I get back on topic, I'm going to take myself off topic. I got my son into music in this last year, and the way I got him into music is I bought him it's not an original, but it's something you can still get them on Amazon, kind of a knockoff Walkman.
Nice.
And I found a bunch of cassettes that my parents had that I used to listen to.
Oh, cool.
And then I went on eBay and found a bunch of stuff that I used to listen to as well. And so now my son is into music through a growing cassette collection. And this is one I haven't given to him yet. He's 9 years old. He's he's into rock and stuff like that. But I also have been giving him the Guardians of the Galaxy. You can buy new stuff on cassette. So this is the Guardian Galaxy Volume 3
nice.
Cassette that I bought off of Amazon, and it's awesome.
Cool. So have you introduced him to a number 2 pencil yet, and the usefulness of that with
oh yeah, he knows how to use it. He knows that. Oh, you mean to unspool? Yeah, I did take him through a demo of that, because he ended up his cassette player ended up chewing up Metallica's Ride the Lightning a couple weeks back. So I had to go, this is how you fix it.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's so cool. I actually, it's funny that you say that, because I just saw, and I wanted it so bad, I just saw an iPhone case that was a cassette tape, like an old school Maxell or RCA tape. So from the back, your phone actually looks like a cassette tape.
That's sweet.
It's really sweet. Yeah.
So how do we get on this subject? We got on the subject because I said phone call. And
you were on a phone call earlier this week.
I was like, yeah, I was on phone. I was on the telly.
Right.
And so the comment back, or the question to me was like, oh, well, what use cases have you seen with Tracer? And I couldn't answer the question in a very straightforward way, because they were looking to like, oh, this is primarily used for like space planning, or like showing the program in 3D or showing something else. And I was like, well, we've seen a lot of them. So there's the planning and programming stuff that architects like to use, like space tracking and showing blocking and stacking of rooms. And then we've seen an uptick in contractors downloading the tool, because what they want to do is they want to take the Revit model, turn it into a database, and then and then attach Power BI to like their costing and scheduling database, and then create a dashboard that shows like a timeline of construction or shows element installation and tracking over time. And we've seen owners using it for, maybe as a component to their digital twin solution, where it's like, oh, yeah, we're going to have Power BI, and that's going to be attached to this real-time database that's giving Power BI X information about our facility, and the 3D piece is, there to convey the model. And so people are like really scrapping together interesting use cases out of it, again, in unanticipated ways. We've had, and speaking of unanticipated ways, we've had people that are in like biomedical and chemistry, like wanting to show digital models of, biology or like DNA structures. Like, hey, will this help us show like the mesh of this structure over here, this chemical structure, and with the data that we're collecting? I'm like, sure, why not? I know nothing about this. In fact, I came very close to failing chemistry when I was in high school. But
I'm the last person you want to ask that.
Yeah, I'm the last person you want to ask. Yeah, 3D, sure, but
right.
I know nothing about what you do. But yeah, so that the versatility of the business intelligence platforms like Power BI and others really start, it to me, it becomes a really interesting design tool in a way, wherein instead of designing I think back to when I was in school, or even when I was doing a lot of competition work in designing your board, and you have your rendering, and you have maybe some, the diagram,
right.
And Power BI is like, well, what if you gave an owner or gave your client a dashboard that lets them explore that in a way, and do so in a way that you've curated and you've published as a designer,
and be fully interactive. I think I'm remembering one of your AU classes that I attended years and years ago, where you were basically showing this at its initial state, I think. And because you had like the Revit, example project in Power BI. I don't think it was 3D yet. I think it was just 2D at that point. And you were just typing in a query, and it was isolating information and showing you like how many classrooms are in this building. It was like you could ask it a question in regular language, and it would kind of parse that and filter that data down and just show you what you were asking. And I remember just like opening up my eyes to the possibilities here for allowing someone else who is not a designer, who's not working in Revit, who's not working on the project, to be able to track progress, answer questions with a client, make sure that you're on track with the program, like all the pieces are there, that the sizes are right. It was amazing to see, using a completely different tool to kind of look through that into the model, but something that anybody could access. And I think that's what really was eye-opening to me about it back then.
I think there's something like, and this in some ways feeds into our, we can maybe lightly touch on the strategy stuff here, because there is a underlying philosophy in play when it comes to that I guess you could call it an attitude or an approach. If you can give a non-expert information or data that once previously required an expert, but you're giving it to them in a way that they can then digest and understand, you've all of a sudden set up what in my view would be like the foundational part of a digital transformation. Digital tools and technology are not transformational if they are relegated to a select few, in my view. They need to be something that it allows us to have them opened up to a cross section of stakeholders, of people, such that they can participate. And when I think about the Power BI and the stuff that we're doing with semantic and tracer, it's really about that. It's about people to compose a model, whether it's a Rhino model or a Revit model. That requires expertise. That requires someone to go into the 3D world and construct their model.
Mm-hmm.
But then if you have publishing tools, stuff that allows you to take that information and put it in a way that with a nominal amount of knowledge of how you might rotate a 3D view or click on a bar graph and see the impact of that selection on a model, you've all of a sudden made an opaque process far more transparent and allows for more people to participate than were participating previously. And then you've created some level of foundation for a transformational conversation.
Yeah. I would say, like, to be really specific about it, is you're letting them drive. And that's a big deal, because you could do everything that you just said by watching over someone's shoulder,
Sure.
who is the expert driver, but to actually give them the steering wheel is
Mm-hmm.
a completely different game, because it's actually starting to create a relationship between the person and the data, not even the tool necessarily, but like what are the answers that they're trying to get. And that creates a level of transparency. It creates a level of accountability to build trust in the system and build a relationship with the people who are allowing or enabling that even to happen. And that there's way bigger impacts to that allows for for a project than without it. And that's where that transformation can actually gain a foothold. Because if it's just tools and there's no trust and there's no relationship, then it's just tools. Like it doesn't actually make a difference.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's another aspect to it that I think is also really important, is that it somehow there needs to be a bit of a fun side to it.
Agreed.
Like we've seen many dashboards, reports and things like that just by that contain a lot of really good information, but just by nature of them being boring as hell, no one wants to look at them
Right.
or gain any insight. And so when I think about this idea of composing and publishing,
Mm-hmm.
and the element of creativity that can go into it, it's in some ways like designing a game. You want the game to be fun.
Right.
You want there to be self-discovery by the person playing it. And so you, as a designer of, say, your dashboard that has attachments into BIM or Rhino or any of these other applications, you want it to be such that there's a level of intuition, there's a level of like, I want to go deeper, and you want to encourage this kind of interaction with the data that helps that end user become educated,
Mm-hmm.
but also have fun with it along the way. Like, hey, I've never seen this before, or hey, isn't this cool? And if we can create tools that are helping designers compose in that way, then I think that's where we want to be.
Yeah, I love that idea too, because like you use the analogy of like laying out your boards when you were in school, right? And you're placing views on sheets, probably in InDesign, or back in my day it was Quark Express, right? And it was like that. You draw a frame and then you decide what you're going to put in that frame. It could be text, it could be an image. Now it's a fully interactive 3D model that if you click on this frame over here, it's going to isolate that information and it's going to update in these other views to reflect kind of the thing that you're drilling down into. But it creates that, it's another level, right? Because of the interactivity than just the 2D boards on the wall were. And it encourages exploration, and it encourages someone to scratch an itch and find out something that isn't just apparent on the surface. It is deeper. And that is what's so interesting, I think, about architecture in general, is real architecture does that as well in a spatial way. Maybe it does it with light. Maybe it does it with color. Maybe it does it with texture. Maybe it does it with the size and proportion of the room. But we're talking about using this to get us there. And this building this relationship along the way, using tools like this that enable that to happen, is a fantastic way to deliver that project and include people in the process along the way.
Right.
Yeah, super cool.
There's also, there's an element here where there's also I think a component to what we do that also operates, we try to do new things, but we also build on what's there, in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
We're not, Proving Ground isn't a company that we're not designing our own ground up platform, which I think requires a very different kind of business model,
Mm-hmm.
right? We have amazing kind of platforms being built by the ground up by the folks at like Hypar, and others out there, right? We are, building tools that naturally extend things that people are already familiar with to a degree. So like Conveyor, Rhino and Revit are known commodities in the world of design. We're trying to introduce another level of integration in there. Power BI is a well-established product, and the idea of creating, web viewable, 3D reports is also somewhat familiar. But we're trying to layer in this idea of ease, of accessibility, and the idea of like a no code type of environment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's also been advantageous because it allows us to tap into existing infrastructure. If we're able to sort of say like, hey, our tools work with your stuff, because that's what they're designed to do.
Mm-hmm.
There's a, there's an appetite there to be like, oh, okay, we don't need to overhaul our entire kind of IT or software infrastructure to get to this capability you're talking about. You're naturally extending and taking us to a place that is, built on what we have as our skill sets and our infrastructure, and taking it to another level.
It reminds me of like old car magazines where it was like bolt-on performance, right? And it was like anybody can do it, that's the idea, right? It's like you've already got the building blocks in place, you have the expertise, and now you're just going to extend the capabilities or get a little bit more with just an add-on that helps do the things that in other ways are extremely difficult to do. You couldn't piece that together yourself without an extremely large amount of effort, right? So yeah, the value in the tool is kind of obvious the first time you use it.
Right.
This episode is made possible with support from Confluence. If you've been listening to the Troxel podcast, you've heard of our next sponsor for this episode, Confluence. But we have something new to announce. Confluence is now more than invite-only live events. It's now also a podcast. And it's very cool, if I do say so myself, because it's a joint collaboration between me here at Troxel and Randall Stevens of Avail, who is the creator of Confluence, as well as having been on this podcast a couple of times talking about the AEC tech industry that we all love. So who's the show for? Well, have you ever written software? Or wondered why the software you use works the way it does? Or want to find out how the people who make the software in our industry do their work? Then this is the show for you. I like to describe the Confluence podcast as the director's commentary track for AEC industry software, because in each episode, we go behind the scenes of AEC software development and talk directly with the developer to dissect a feature and their workflows and get an inside view of how and why they made the decisions they did while creating the software you use. Randall describes it as the AEC industry software version of the How I Built This podcast, which we are both huge fans of. Confluence is a visual show in which our guests show their work. We think you're really going to like it, and we already have a few episodes out for you to watch. You can find it on YouTube and Spotify right now. Just search for Confluence Podcast on those platforms, or click the direct links I've put in the show notes for this episode. Go check it out, and please subscribe. No, really, just go check it out and subscribe right now. This episode will still be here when you get back. My thanks to Confluence for supporting this episode of the Troxel Podcast.
So let's talk about this strategy thing. I mean, because this, I think, does kind of provide the gateway into that part of the conversation, right? Because this is where you're now addressing the other people in the room, right? And because a lot of times I think the software, the startups are focused on the actual users of the software. But there's this whole other world to the business of architecture where there's decision makers and stakeholders in many different levels beyond the actual users who are delivering the projects, right?
That's right.
And there's even different layers there, right? There's the juniors and the mids and the seniors, and that everyone kind of touches things in a different way. But then you've got that on the, the overhead side as well of the business. And so I'm interested to kind of hear what you've been noticing in the business of architecture and how you're helping address some of the digital transformation side of that with the tools that you're releasing, but also with the strategy and you're doing your own kind of analysis of these firms, right? To help them understand the landscape that they're in, how they're participating in it in ways in which they may not even be aware of, because you get to step back and you get to look across the entire landscape.
Yeah. So strategy, the strategic work that we do was really among, I think, some of the earliest consulting projects that we've been a part of. It's sort of been the way that we're able to connect and create, I think, meaningful collaborations from. And you used the term earlier, the idea of trust, because trust is really the currency that I think a good strategy relies on in order to make it actionable. There needs to be trust between, I would say we'd call us maybe coaches and people that we're helping to coach. And there also needs to be trust among the stakeholders within a business to realize the potential of the things that they're interested in realizing. And so the strategy work that we do is, I call it it's like the 30,000 foot view of an organization and what the impact of digital can and should be within that company. And I think there's a misconception usually right off the bat that we're going to come in and we're going to tell them which tools to use, and then that's going to solve it. Or that we're going to come in with a new set of technologies that they've never heard of before, and that's going to be something that they're going to implement as the next stage. What more often is the case is that an architectural business or a construction business or an owner-operator business, they might have a lot of the tools and the technology in place to some degree. And it's right there. I mean, it's like right on their desktop in some way. But what they're missing is the attention to process and the attention to people and their skills in order to motivate the organization to really see the benefit. As part of, it's part of a lot of my introductory talks that I give on the subject of strategy. It deals with two components to a successful strategy. There's this idea of the SMART component, and we've heard the term smart business, work smarter, not harder, and those types of things, right? That refers to okay, you have the technology, you have the tools, you might have different tactics that you're employing those tools with. But then there's, maybe knowledge management's a part of that, kind of the smart side, right? Content management. It's like the nuts and bolts that go into making a smarter organization. But then you also have the health side. So smart and healthy. Healthy is the part that is far more challenging to address in a strategic way, and actually requires way more effort and attention from people that are non-technologists. Sure. Which is why I really like this, because what you have to do within what, in my view, a healthy organization is an organization that has levels of accountability for certain initiatives that are taking place. There is maybe even a sense of equity within an organization, i.e. equity both in terms of how you're thinking about how a certain capability can spread equitably across a staff, but also people that might be contributing to that, are they getting an upside from it? in a meaningful way in their work and their paycheck, something like that. There's also communication, something far overlooked, like, hey, you have a new thing. How is it being like talked about in your company?
Right.
And then there's the big B, which is behavior as part of the healthy side. Is your team set up in such a way where they are being motivated to change the way they do things? And that one right there is probably you could call it the biggest speed bump or barrier in any organization when it comes to digital transformation. And I'm sure you've heard it in many of the places that you've worked. Why are you doing something a certain way? The answer is usually, well, that's just the way I've always done it. Yeah. And there's very little motivation to push an individual to sort of be like, well, maybe I should look at it a different way or change the way I'm working. And so
this is why you have to engage those leaders as well, because that mentality comes out of, I don't have time to look at another way to do it. I don't know that there's a better way to do it. And the project has been built around slicing up time in the way that we've always done things. And so therefore, you give me that amount of time to do the thing, I will take that amount of time to do the thing.
That's right. The B is for behavior, but the B is also for bias, right? It's like they have through their professional upbringing, through the habits that we build, the rules of thumb that we cultivate. These are great things in many respects because it allows us to work. We are gaining experience. We are developing rules of thumb. We are figuring out faster ways to shortcut problems that we always encounter. These are necessities for us to be successful. But if we're not careful, those habits and those rules of thumb can also put the blinders on our ability to see other possibilities. Yeah. And that's kind of what I like to think about our strategy is like, can we come into the room and help take some of those blinders off and help motivate an organization at different levels, whether it's the designer doing the project, or it's the project manager that's trying to figure out how to staff a project appropriately, or it's the executive trying to make a high level decision on where to invest in training, in a new capability, or how they might be developing a relationship with a prospective client. Can we help them look past maybe some of what they know and get into an area where they might be uncomfortable at first, but recognize that, hey, this new capability can take us where we want to go. And if we can get that kind of attitude in place, then the roadmap, and a roadmap is usually like what I refer to as a roadmap is usually the artifact that comes out of every strategy engagement, kind of sets a near, mid, and long-term set of goals. That roadmap becomes very much easier to execute because you can see where you're going and you have this level of buy-in at these different levels that help people know where they're going and know how they are participants in that ride together.
So many times someone like you, Nate, will come into a business and do the thing that you just talked about. You'll create this report, you'll create the roadmap, and then you're out. And then they're left to their own devices. And there maybe aren't some directly responsible individuals for each key element on there. And it tends to, I don't know, I guess it's just my experience, but it's like, if there's no one owning it, it doesn't happen, right? It was like, we went through the exercise, we checked the box, we realized the things that we never realized before. I was reminded, I think, of Donald Rumsfeld's quote, right? We have the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. And it's like, you can't fault someone for not knowing what they don't know, because they're so busy on the projects, delivering the things, doing it the way that they've always done it, that they're not even coming up for air to kind of survey the current state to see what else out there is possible. You, as this injection, get to come in and kind of show people what might be possible after you've listened to them. I mean, as far as like efficacy goes to these kinds of relationships that you enter into with them, I'm sure you've seen it go both ways, good and bad. But I mean,
Yeah.
if you were to kind of assign a ratio to it, what do you think that would be for implementation and success of those interactions?
I would say, there's I don't know if I have like like a statistical like percentage where I could say like, hey, these, folks, we're at 80%.
80/20, always.
Yeah, we're at 80/20. We're at 80/20. 80% of the time, our strategies work every time. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know if I can say that with certainty, but what I can say is that there definitely is the breakdown that you described. There are companies that we've worked with where we've come in and we've done the strategy. We've even set up the kind of like an accountability structure and who's doing what. And then we'll check in on them, 6 months later, a year later, and be like, hey, how are those? Or we'll see them at an event, be like, hey, how are those, some of those initiatives we worked with you on going? Like, well, we just haven't been able to find the time to do the the machine learning study or to enact the new training program.
Mm-hmm.
And but we're gonna get to it, and you kind of scratch your head a little bit.
Yeah.
You're like, yeah, that maybe that one's not gonna
right.
pick up steam. But then we have the ones that are very like, we've had repeat strategies where it was like we would do like a 3-year plan, and the team that was responsible for looking at the tactics and the strategies that we had been talking about was very diligent about going through each one, and they were starting to see results. And at the end of 3 years, we're now, like I said, we're an 8-year-old company.
Yeah.
We're now able to have repeat strategies where they're like, hey, we're done with our roadmap. We're able to do X, Y, and Z. Let's do another one and look at the next 3 years based on where we've landed. And they will come to us with a level of confidence that the things that they had done were working out, and that the insight we were able to provide was also going to help them elevate them to the next level. And that becomes a very strong relationship and a high trust relationship. And those are two like examples where it's sort of like we do the thing and then we, like you said, might go away for a while, or we're not like actively involved in the tactics.
You're not actually delivering it. It's up to them to deliver it on it. Yeah.
But we've also been a part of a number of strategies that are like, yeah, we'll work on the tactics together. And oh, by the way, like these 5 over here are things that we can directly help you with. Mm-hmm. Implementing a centralized data warehouse, for example, or setting them up with training around interoperability. Things like that become natural points of entry for us to be more hands-on with the approach. And I tend to like, obviously I like those more because it's like, oh yeah, it's like kind of more business, right?
Yeah.
But it's also, I like them because it gives us more of a hand in the success or failure of what the roadmap could be. And I feel like with more involvement, we're able to help continue to give advice along the way.
Sure.
And that lends itself to a better chance at the transformation succeeding. I will say that I have a blog article that states as much, and is based on some research. Digital transformation initiatives are really, really hard to pull off.
Yeah.
I think there's a statistic out there that they did a survey of like big companies that were initiating digital transformation initiatives. They have like an 82% failure rate, which is like,
there's a number.
Really high. There's a number. It's really high. I mean, because what happens is, and it all comes back to that B word, behavior. Mm-hmm. What they're able to do is you're able to sort of say like these digital transformation initiatives, as well-meaning, as well thought out as they can be, if you're not able to, again, attach their success or failure in a way that is relevant to to a wide range of stakeholders that will see some kind of upside in their work, then they're going to stick with what's known, and they're going to stick with the way that they've always done things. And and that I think is especially true in larger organizations where there's just a lot of complexity, a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of different opinions, and it's easy, I think, if you're an employee in a large company and the kind of upper echelon of leadership comes down like, hey, we're releasing a new strategy. It doesn't matter what it is. It could be related to, the food service as much as it is the technology that they're using.
Sure.
But if it's one of those things where, hey, this is coming on down and my project manager isn't really talking to me about it, and my my principal is just sort of like, okay, whatever, we're going to ride this out for 3 years and then we'll have a new strategy. There's sort of this element of like, yeah, we'll wait and see, as opposed to hey, let's get on this, and that's where you want to get past. You want to get past the wait and see stage and to show results with these strategies that can be meaningful to people.
You mentioned the word upside, and I'm wondering if you have any particular thoughts about, I mean, it is so important for someone to see upside early, is my guess, right? Because I don't do what you do, but that makes a lot of sense. And so do you focus on that a lot on the work that you're doing there? Because I mean, you said you've got a short-term, a mid-term, and a long-term kind of staging of the plan. The short-term stuff, I would assume, kind of has to show value very quickly so that it even has a chance of continuing to that mid-level point. Just general thoughts on that kind of thing.
Yeah, we call them quick wins. And I'm sure it's a common terminology, common consulting terminology, you might say, the quick win. We need a way to demonstrate the value of an opportunity right away so that people can latch on and want to see more, right?
Yeah.
This is where I think computational design has an advantage in a way, because it's not full-blown software development,
right?
But you can still develop extremely powerful automation techniques and technology that will help elevate a process. And so what we oftentimes see is like, okay, we need to get some momentum behind our data management, behind planning and programming. What can we do? Oh, well, let's think about what you're using today and let's prototype something really quick in Grasshopper or Dynamo that allows you to circumvent some waste that we know your teams are dealing with right now. And let's do it in 2 weeks, and develop something that we can get in their hands and help them. And because all of a sudden you're taking a high level, something that might be super high level in the 30,000 foot strategy view, and you're saying, okay, now we're going to bring this down to a solution rapidly that's going to hit the person doing some level of production. And so that all of a sudden can generate a lot of excitement, and also puts a lot of interest behind the technology initiatives. Like, oh, I had no idea we could do this. Why don't we have more computational designers? Where can we get more training? How can I participate in this training? How can I sit in on the next strategy meeting so we can talk about what we need, because we think this could turn into a new tool for us that has broader reach. And those quick wins can help, prompt the questions and prompt the dialogue. And when we build software, that's part of our, I think, workflow in general, is that if we're building something custom, we want to have prototypes, we want to have wireframes, we want to have things that take something from the abstract into something that is actually meaningful and we know can deliver, right?
Just like the architectural design process, right?
Exactly. It's amazing the parallels there. The architectural design process, you want to have, you have your sketches, you have your initial renderings, you go through the different phases of design. That's actually something that we've drawn that parallel before, and it tends to resonate. It's like digital transformation is just another design problem, and you're going through a very similar set of steps. And you might end up with designs that get discarded, and you're going to end up with and think about those as iterations that are taking you on the path to realizing the final project.
It might be circuitous, right? It might not be that straight line that somebody really ideally wants, but rarely ever happens, right? And you do have to have kind of that loopy nature to it too, because you learn in the process, and then you go back and you like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. You're not going all the way back, but you learn something along the way, and you're going to continue on from there. I think it creates a level of ownership too. Like you said, you have this high level report that the highest level people in the company are responding to, but then you take it down to the grassroots, to the floor, and you say, here's a technology that we can introduce that's going to make this person and this process better. And that's going to have an outcome of excitement, and it starts to get their gears turning. And now you have both levels working, right? You have a high level and a grassroots level working together to deliver on those strategies, but actually really in a useful day-to-day way. And I think it does take both to be really successful, right? It's like you've got to see it. You've got to see progress at both ends of the scale, and you've got to have ownership at both ends of the scale for it to have a chance to make it.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
The other thing that I was thinking about when you were talking about these reports is flexibility, and like is how much flexibility is built in, because if you're doing a 3-year report, and I think about what's happened in the last year, it's like the report's got to change, Nate. Something happened in technology, the explosion of large language models, AI as an example, would have an effect on digital transformation, I would assume, pretty obviously, right? And so
maybe
and so I'm just wondering, how do you navigate that as a consultant to these companies, building flexibility into your reports or not?
So I would say that yes, I think I use the term report. I also use the term roadmap. These are very, I would say, by nature, meant to be living documents. The early sort of stage stuff, like the near term tactics that are often like outlined, are far more concrete than the later stuff. And I think what they also need to do, what a good strategy also needs to do, is provide some basis of criticality into them, so you have a North Star that you're headed towards, and what not to get distracted by. And I think that's one of the more dangerous. We don't think about it as often, but it is one of the more dangerous and things that can really derail a strategy, where it's like, oh my God, something new just came along, and I'm going to table everything else and just look at this new thing.
Squirrel. Yeah.
Squirrel. Exactly. And with technology, boy, is that easy.
It's easy.
I can look at my LinkedIn feed right now, and I will show you a feed of dozens of people doing the squirrel thing at this moment. and so what I think is important then is to sort of say, like, okay, we know technology is going to be changing and evolving, and there's going to be a new thing. But what you need to do as a practice is be able to say, like, does this new thing, if we critically look at it, does it support where we want to go? Does it take away from where we want to go? Or is it just a general kind of R&D, and we're just going to kind of wait it out and see what happens? And I think in a lot of cases, if we hear of something new, there's an element that we want to educate ourselves as much as we can about something that is maybe capturing the popular imagination. But there's also an aspect of like, we're going to wait about between 18 and 24 months to see how it actually shakes out, to see if it will be something that is going to concretely move us in a new direction. Because the there's two sides of being an early adopter. You're basically gambling. You are putting a gamble. You're placing a bet. You're like, hey, this new thing is going to be the thing, or it's not going to be the thing. And, it's really a 50-50 shot,
Sure.
How many people I remember when Google Glass came out. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
I knew just maybe a few people that were early adopters, and they were walking around with the Google Glass and they had the thing, and it just fell flat on its face.
Mhm.
And, it wasn't the new thing. And now today you do have some more augmented things. Since you brought it up earlier, I do a lot of swimming. I get ads pushed to me all the time where you can get AR goggles that will show you like all of your stats as you're doing laps. Pretty cool. That was like, oh, this is actually a practical use of that one thing I saw that fell on its face a while back. So you want to have, you want to be careful with the new stuff, I think, in a way where you just want to make sure that you're engaging with it in a way that is going to be productive and it's not a distraction.
Mm-hmm.
And you're not going to be sinking a lot of money into something that ends up being it ends up going nowhere.
Yeah.
There's as we know, this world of architecture, you have, there's a business model attached to it where R&D is already really hard to come by, and justify certain levels of investment. So you're kind of like, okay, is this, the metaverse is a good example of this.
Yeah,
It's like, it kind of blew up last year, right? It was like at first, beginning of the year, everyone was hot on metaverse.
Yeah.
It's like, boom, this is where it's going. And by the end of the year, all those stocks tanked, and
Right.
crypto along with it, and it's like, there's a level of churn that happens in tech that you want to build a critical view around, so you don't get sucked in a way that is going to be detrimental to your goal.
You talked about that critical look of the business over time. And I was thinking, as you're saying that, it's like, because it's come up on this podcast, it's come up on my other podcast, about how architecture in general, the profession, is bad at looking at itself as a design problem, right? Looking at its business as a design problem. And the way that I just started to think about it as you were talking was, it's not like an architectural design problem. It's more like a software design problem, in that the software is kind of never done, right? Where a building is like, yep, at some point you hand it over to the contractor and they hand it over to the owner, and then you're on to the next project, right? And there's, of course, there's software like that too, that just stops getting maintained or whatever. But for the long running apps that we've been using for decades, that have just been like built up over time, and new features added and other ones deprecated, and like, that's what a business is much more like. And so to really have that critical view in an ongoing way, and constantly watching and adjusting, and really having, your fingers on the pulse of what's going on, is of course, this is what leadership in firms are responsible for. And yet there's a lot of businesses out there that could be doing a heck of a lot better because of so many reasons.
I mean, the opposite of all of this is true. Like, there's one side, you don't want to get caught up, but you don't want to have the blinders on where you're going to get, sideswiped by something that you didn't know was coming. With the large language model and the AI stuff, I mean, that's been a long time coming. It's been there. It's been kind of it's been present in the discourse. If you had your pulse on the conversations, and present in the discourse for a really long time, and now we're seeing prompt engines and things like that, which are it's making it it's getting into the popular kind of imagination in a way that it had previously, and people are like, where'd this come from? Like, well, it's kind of been there,
right. Yeah. It's crazy. I think also about the idea of the innovation curve versus the adoption curve. And so you're watching this from I think it's framed in your world under the guise of digital transformation, right? Which is kind of the actual adoption of innovation and technology in business to do better, to do more, to whatever the outcomes that you're looking for are. What do you see as there? Because the way that I've described it in talks that I've given is like innovators are, and this is a belief that we've kind of established it within our company that we share, is innovators are innovating on top of innovation, and therefore the curve is up and to the right. I mean, that's the direction that it goes, because you can't even help it. Like those are the people who think like that naturally are going to do that. And then there's the people doing the work who maybe do have the blinders on in some categories, and maybe they're aware of other things in other categories, but the adoption curve is much lower and slower. Mm-hmm. And so that chasm by definition only gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Right. I'm wondering what you think about that, because you're actually boots on the ground, even trying to help people get over that gap in their firms. And so how do you see that? Do you see it like that, or do you see it differently?
No, it's true. I mean, you're really kind of speaking to, there's that quote, "The future is here. It's just not evenly distributed." Mm-hmm. That's very true. Especially in the world of construction. There are firms that are doing amazing, innovative stuff, like you just described. It's innovation on top of innovation. They're accelerating. And then you have firms that are decidedly not doing that. And they, I had a call just last 2 weeks, and I dropped the term grasshopper. I just said, "Oh yeah, we built some tools with Grasshopper," and they were like, "Grasshopper, what's that?" And
legitimate
for all
question.
legitimate question. I've been trying to figure that out for like the last 13 years.
Right.
I've been really thinking about it. But we take for granted how well established some of these products are, and some people just have not engaged at all. And for all intents and purposes, the firm that I was talking with at that point in time was profitable and had a good customer base and was moving along just fine.
Right.
And I think that's an important thing, that it's always important to have those kinds of gut checks. Is like, just because something is innovative, doesn't necessarily negate or supersede or override the benefit of doing things in a way that's already established as well. So like, I'm not, I think you're right. I think you're right that you have innovators that are always going to be, moving that curve up and to the right. But I think this comes back to the kind of point I was making earlier about being critical about where you're at, where you're going, and maybe it's just who I am as well. Because when I was at MBBJ, I was the grasshopper guy, and I love building stuff in Grasshopper. But I tell you, when it came crunch time, there was nothing stopping me from being like, you know what? I'm going to get in these CAD plans, and we're going to be ripping through the document. Yeah, we're going to be ripping through the document set.
Yeah.
Like, you have to do it, and you have to do it to get by, and you need to kind of rely on those experiences too. Mm-hmm. So in many ways it comes down to, maybe there's an element of balance there. Like, there's so much expertise. Like you talked about the gray hairs in this industry, right? Earlier, and how, and I may be getting to be one of those too, at this point, but there's so much experience there. And just because there's new stuff coming in, and just because there are, highly innovative technologies, while you don't want to have people putting their blinders on, you also don't want to negate very well established experience,
right,
on how a building comes together, how architecture gets made. Um, I think you almost want to, we called it, it was kind of, there's like a term that was popular there for a while. It's called upward mentoring or reverse mentoring,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
something we often advocated for in a lot of strategies. Also was something that MBBJ was kind of big on, is that you would pair up your, someone that is doing new things and engaging with new content. Maybe it's Grasshopper, maybe it's rendering, maybe it's, um, a different form of design. You'd pair those individuals up with people that are very well established in the field, and you would try to set up a mechanism where they can learn from each other.
Yeah.
And feed forward. So it's not a pure dichotomy of people that aren't doing it and people that are doing it. It's more of like, what can you share in order to make a product, to generate kind of a productive transformation that operates in both ways.
The Venn diagram, the greens and the grays, right? That spot, that sweet spot in the middle. There was a book written by one of the partners, I believe it was in BBJ, and it was called Designing the Design Firm, and they did talked about that in there. That was a fantastic book about leadership in design firms.
Yeah.
This idea, and maybe we should start to wrap up here, but I've the whole idea of that bi-directional. I mean, talk about interoperability, Nate.
Yeah. That's what it all comes down. It all comes back to interoperability, bi-directional exchange of data.
It is about creating these connections between experience and wisdom, right? I mean, it is interesting also to think about those people who are the operators using these maybe high-tech solutions early in their career, but not knowing the things that they need to know to actually deliver a project, and creating the connections between those. Because like you talk about, navigating the building code, talk about navigating a stakeholder meeting, talk about getting a client to sign off on something and go to the next level, or an ad service, or and I think it's funny because you always see these analogies being driven toward like the automotive industry in design, or any kind of product-based design, and applying those ideas to architecture. And look how much better architecture would be if we only did this thing. And it's like, it is actually a completely different animal. It is completely different. How many times does a automotive firm engage a customer to ask them their preference when they're designing a car? Like, hardly ever is my guess, is the answer to that. I'm sure it happens, but like the architectural design process is completely different than that. Completely different. And it's interesting to me to kind of see or listen to you talk about the experience that you've had throughout your career to navigate like this really complicated thing called an architectural design practice, right? I mean, and it is a practice. It is a project. It is this ongoing, it's not a product. It is a project, and it is constantly being reevaluated, and the goalposts are always moving, and the people who are in those companies are always moving around. And it's just this really interesting kind of, what's the word? Organic thing that's just constantly changing all the time.
Yeah. And then, that's at just a singular business level.
Right.
And it's even more true as you get out and think about like the larger team structure that goes behind a project. It's always interesting for me to think about, hey, when a project team finishes a project, the odds of that team coming together again in that exact same way to do a project again that's almost identical is also rare.
Yeah.
And you have to figure out, okay, how are we adapting to a new context with new collaborators? It may even be the same client, but you're paired with like a different contractor, a different engineering team. And you need to figure out tactics that will help you grapple with that. And how can you take, one of the big questions we often ask our clients in a strategic, from a strategic perspective, is like, how do you take what you just finished on one project and mobilize what you've learned to support the next one. And if you're a firm that has figured that out, I think you are in a position that is far better than most. I would say you're in the 99th percentile, and you, even if that firm itself is not a digital firm, you're probably putting yourself, by just figuring that one part out, figuring out how you're going to learn from one project to the next and expand and improve, you've probably set yourself up to be more of an innovator than any firm that has the latest cutting edge tools. In my view, you've created a healthy organization that is continually trying to learn, and that you are naturally going to innovate and evolve with technology over time, because you've mobilized a very healthy behavior.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a perfect place to wrap this one up.
All right.
We've done a lot. We've covered a lot here. I will include links to everything that you've brought up in this conversation in the show notes for this episode, which I encourage people to read. But if you could just tell everybody where they can find you, that would be fantastic.
Sure. So I am on LinkedIn. That's probably the primary place you'll be able to connect with me on a professional level. So if you search Nathan Miller on LinkedIn, I think my title says something obtuse like I'm a digital transformation specialist. So look for that. And then you can also find Proving Ground on Instagram. And then in the show notes, you should, I'll make sure Evan here has links to my website, or the Proving Ground website, as well as the Proving Ground app site, where you can try out some of the software I've mentioned.
Fantastic. Nathan,
I am no longer on, I was going to say, I'm no longer on Twitter or Facebook.
That's right.
That's another thing that's changed since 2020. A lot of social media has fallen by the wayside for me, and I highly recommend it.
You are on Mastodon. I've connected.
I am on Mastodon.
But are any of us really on Mastodon? Not that much, probably.
And that's the way I like it. I like being able to sort of let it sit. And I feel like I can just let it sit for weeks at a time, and then I'll come back to it. Right. Mastodon's great. Awesome. No algorithm trying to keep me addicted.
Awesome. Well, Nathan, this is a true pleasure always to talk to you, and I look forward to hopefully seeing you in the near future. We'll see what happens.
I hope so too.
Yeah. All right.
Thanks for having me on for part 2.
All right. Anytime.
Thanks to our sponsors, and thanks to our members this week. Find out how you can become a member at trxl.co, and I'll talk to you again next week.